Senator Britt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, as you know, we have limited time, so I want to get started off with just some very high-level questions, yes or no, and then we can get into details as time allows. First, do you believe that there is a crisis at the southwest border?
Ranking Member Britt, I think there is a very serious challenge at the southern border, as I have articulated.
Yes, sir. Are you willing to call it a crisis?
I consider it a very significant challenge, and I am focused on the substance of the issue and the devotion of resources most effectively to address the challenge that we confront as a country.
Yes, sir. I'm disappointed to not hear you call it a crisis, truly, because I think that's what we have before us. When we look at the budget that President Biden put forward, it's clear that this administration is not afraid of calling out a crisis when they believe they see one. I will note that we have mentioned in the budget a climate crisis. We have mentioned a youth mental crisis. We have a maternal health crisis, a behavioral health crisis. We have a wildfire crisis. We have a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous persons. We have a biodiversity crisis, and we even have a roadway and pedestrian safety crisis. Now, my point here is not to diminish the seriousness of each and every one of those topics that I just listed. It is to show that President Biden and this administration is not afraid of calling out a crisis if they believe they have one. So I ask you one more time, do you believe we have a crisis at the southwest border?
Ranking Member Britt, let me assure you that whatever language is used does not impact the fact that we are devoting every ounce of energy to address the challenge.
I am hopeful that we can get on the same page about this. When you look at what happens, what would trigger this? If you look at Title 42 ending on May 11th, your own department has said we're going to see almost probably doubled numbers coming across the border at that point in time. Will that elevate it to this administration being able to call it for what it is, a crisis?
Ranking Member Britt, what we have done is we have provided projections, not necessarily in terms of what we anticipate seeing, but rather what we need to plan for.
Well, let's talk about fentanyl then. When we see how much is coming over the border, I mentioned it, and it has already been mentioned here by the chair, but we lost over 100,000 people to drug overdoses, and 70,000 of those, as you mentioned yourself, are attributed to fentanyl. When we look at what's coming across the border, you said in your testimony right now that that is the single greatest challenge facing our nation. So do you believe we have a fentanyl crisis in this nation?
I think the word that you used, Ranking Member Britt, is so appropriate, that we have a scourge of fentanyl. I think it's over 70,000 American lives have been lost. And
is that coming, the majority of that fentanyl coming over the southwest border?
It is coming through. I think it is more than 90% is actually being trafficked through the ports of entry at our southern border. Yes,
what are we doing to be able to capture that at the ports of entry?
So we have surged resources to an unprecedented degree to detect, to interdict the fentanyl from coming, and to investigate and prosecute the individuals who are traffickers.
Okay, what are we doing? Obviously, it has been made note that the Chinese Communist Party are sending those precursors over to Mexico, and what are we doing to disrupt and dismantle that transnational criminal organization, to disrupt that network?
We have brought unprecedented force to that effort, Ranking Member Britt, and I'd like to just cite the new surge operation that we launched last week, Operation Blue Lotus, that I directed, of Homeland Security investigations. We have brought additional Homeland Security investigations agents to the ports of entry so that they have an increased and immediate physical presence there, not only for the assistance in the interdiction of the drugs, but critically for the immediate investigation, apprehension, and ultimately prosecution of the traffickers themselves.
And I appreciate that, and I want you to hear me say we've got to continue to do more. This is affecting communities all across our country. It is affecting children. It is the leading cause of death between the ages of 18 and 45 in this nation. It is without a doubt a crisis. And I will say once again that I am disappointed that I can't hear you say those words as well. Additionally, I'd like to talk about the border and its security. The chair has already alluded to the fact that whether we talk about operational control or whether we talk about maximizing resources, I'm actually not interested interested in those definitions. What I am interested in is, from your perspective as the Secretary of Homeland Security, do you believe we have a secure border?
Ranking Member Britt, I think I have addressed this issue. As I mentioned, the words we use do not define the actions that we take. The challenge that we confront defines the actions that we take, and we are using every ounce of energy and resource we have to address the challenges not only at our southern border with respect to irregular migration, not only with respect to trafficking of fentanyl, but across the entire breadth of mission of the Department of Homeland Security.
Respectfully, Mr. Secretary, it's not enough. We have a humanitarian crisis, a national security crisis, the face of which becomes very real. You mentioned your trips to the border. I have went to the border 3 times in the first 2 months to see it myself. When you have a border that is 2,000 miles long, there's no way to capture it all without going and seeing and continuing to look and learn. We must do better. Our border is not secure, and we owe it to the citizens of this nation. We owe it to the people who are being trafficked by these drug cartels to take back control. Speaking of, the Border Patrol chief this month said, quote, "The cartels control an awful lot of the southern border south of the United States," end quote. Yes or no, do you agree with that statement?
That is Chief Ortiz, whom I selected to lead our Border Patrol, and I'm very proud of his leadership. I do believe that the cartels control a significant amount of territory south of our border, which is why we have an all-of-government effort to attack those cartels.
So I agree as well, and when you visit, it becomes very clear. Following up on that, do you believe that the cartels have a growing influence north of our southern border?
I believe that they have their tentacles in the United States, as they have had for many years. They have grown significantly in sophistication and size and capability since I spent my time prosecuting members of that organization when I served as a federal prosecutor.
And Mr. Secretary, I'm out of time, but I will say I agree. When we look at what drug cartels are doing, not only south of our border, but here in our country, we are allowing this crisis to make these cartels rich to the tune of billions of dollars, and the cost of that, real human faces and children in our community all across this country. So thank you, Mr. Ranking Member.